I came home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, still in my scrubs, feet aching, thinking about nothing except a hot shower and 8 hours of sleep, and my car was gone. Not stolen, not missing, gone in the deliberate, calculated way that only one thing in this world produces: a flatbed truck, a tow company, and someone who called them on purpose. My car from my own driveway at 11:30 at night. I stood at the end of my driveway and stared at the empty concrete rectangle where my car was supposed to be, and I felt something that I can only describe as a complete short circuit of the brain. The kind of disbelief you experience when reality presents you with something so unreasonable that your mind simply refuses to accept it for a full 30 seconds. Then I saw the orange notice stuck to my mailbox post. Vehicle removed per HOA Resolution 14B, unauthorized parking. Contact Ridgeline Towing for vehicle retrieval. Fee, $285. My own driveway, my own car, $285 to get it back. I peeled that notice off my mailbox, and I stood there in the dark in my hospital scrubs, and I made a decision that I have never once regretted. Every single person responsible for this was going to understand exactly how this felt. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally, their cars towed, every last one. My name is Priya Anand. I'm a registered nurse. I have worked in the same hospital for 9 years, and I own a home at 31 Holloway Ridge in the Crestwood Park HOA community, which I purchased 4 years ago after renting for most of my adult life and deciding that I wanted one thing, just one thing, that was entirely, permanently, unambiguously mine. The house is modest. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard with a garden I have been building slowly for 3 years. The driveway is a standard 2-car concrete pad that came with the house, set back from the street, entirely within my property line, not obstructing anything. I have a car, one car, a 7-year-old sedan that I bought used and maintain carefully because I cannot afford to replace it, and it is my only way to get to work. I park it in my driveway. I have always parked it in my driveway. This is what driveways are for. Let me tell you about HOA Resolution 14B, because it is the most absurd document I have ever read, and I have read hospital intake forms at 3 in the morning, which is saying something. Resolution 14B was passed by the Crestwood Park HOA board 8 months before my car was towed. I was not at the meeting when it was passed. I work night shifts, 3 or 4 nights a week, 12 hours each, and HOA meetings happen on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m., which is precisely when I am either sleeping before a shift or driving to one. Resolution 14B established new parking regulations for Crestwood Park. The stated purpose was to address concerns about parking congestion and aesthetic consistency in driveway areas. The specific provision that applied to me, Section 3, Clause C, stated that vehicles parked in driveways must be currently registered, operational, and in a condition consistent with community standards. A separate clause, Section 3, Clause D, stated that any vehicle with expired registration visible from the street was subject to removal. My registration had expired by 11 days. 11 days! I had renewed it online. The sticker was in the mail. I had the confirmation email on my phone showing renewal date, payment confirmation, the whole thing. But the physical sticker had not yet arrived, and without the sticker on my plate, my registration appeared expired to anyone who walked up to my car and looked at the rear plate, which apparently someone had done at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night while I was at work saving lives. I need to tell you about the HOA board of Crestwood Park, because understanding them is essential to understanding everything that comes next. The board has 5 members. The president is a man named Don Whitaker, who retired early from a career in insurance, has lived in Crestwood Park for 12 years, and governs the HOA with the energy of a man who has found his true calling 15 years too late. He is organized, procedural, and completely incapable of distinguishing between the letter of a rule and the spirit of it. The vice president is a woman named Carol Finch, who seconded every motion Don has ever made and whose primary qualification for the position appears to be availability and enthusiasm. The other three members are Steve Garvey, who owns a landscaping business and mostly shows up, Linda Torres, who is a genuinely reasonable person who has been outvoted consistently for 2 years, and Phil Barrett, who I believe has never said a single word at a board meeting that was not, "I agree with Don." Don Whittaker did not personally call the towing company on the night my car was taken. He had contracted with Ridgeline Towing to perform regular parking patrols of the community, a contract he had arranged without a community vote, at a rate of $300 per month for 2 patrol nights per week. Ridgeline received the patrol fee and also kept a portion of every tow fee collected from residents. There was a financial incentive, in other words, to find violations. I learned all of this later. On the night my car was towed, I knew none of it. I knew only the orange notice on my mailbox post and the empty driveway and the $285 fee standing between me and my only transportation. I called Ridgeline Towing. I was on hold for 14 minutes. The man who answered was not apologetic. He told me the vehicle had been towed under HOA authorization, that the fee was $285, and that storage fees began accruing at midnight at $30 per day. It was 11:52 p.m. I said, "I have proof that my registration was renewed 11 days ago. I have the confirmation email." He said, "Ma'am, we act on what's visible on the plate. You'll need to take that up with your HOA." I said, "I need my car for work." He said, "We are open until midnight and then again at 7 a.m. It was 11:52. Their lot was on the other side of town. I had no car to get there. I called a rideshare. I got to Ridgeline Towing at 11:58 p.m. I showed them my email confirmation of registration renewal. The man at the counter, not the same man from the phone, a different man, equally unapologetic, said, "We need the physical registration document or the sticker to release on renewal grounds. Email confirmation isn't sufficient." I paid $285 on my credit card. I drove home, I showered. I did not sleep. I lay in bed in the dark and thought about what had happened and felt the specific kind of anger that comes not from a single incident, but from the cumulative weight of being a person who follows rules, works hard, causes no harm, and still ends up standing at a tow lot at midnight paying $285 for having a sticker in the mail. In the morning, I called my neighbor Janet Chen, who is a paralegal and who I trust completely. Janet said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, first question, do you know where the board members park their cars?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Do they park in their driveways, on the street? Do any of them have guest parking situations?" I said, "I don't know. Why?" She said, "Because if you're going to respond to this, you should respond in a way that makes the point as clearly as possible. And the clearest possible point would be, in my personal opinion, to have their cars towed." I said, "Janet." She said, "I'm not saying do it illegally. I'm saying find out if any of their vehicles are in violation of any applicable rule or ordinance, and if they are, report them through the proper channels." She paused. She said, "And also, before any of that, we need to read every single word of Resolution 14B and every parking ordinance in this city, because I have a feeling this resolution has some problems." Janet is almost always right about legal feelings. Janet came over that Saturday with coffee and her laptop, and we spent 4 hours going through documents. Resolution 14B first. The resolution had been passed at a board meeting with 3 members present, Don, Carol, and Phil. That was a quorum under the HOA bylaws, which required 3 of 5 members for a quorum, technically valid. But here was something interesting. The Crestwood Park CC and RS included a provision, Section 11, subsection F, stating that any resolution establishing ongoing contracts with outside vendors must be approved by a majority of the full board, meaning at least 3 of 5 members must affirmatively vote in favor. Not just be present, vote in favor. At the meeting where Resolution 14B passed, the vote was 3 in favor, 0 opposed, with Linda Torres and Steve Garvey absent. 3 affirmative votes out of 5 members technically satisfied the majority of the full board requirement. 3 is a majority of 5. But the towing contract, the contract with Ridgeline Towing, had been arranged separately at a different meeting with only Don and Carol present. 2 members, not a majority of the full board. The towing contract had potentially been approved without proper authority. Janet made a note. Then we looked at city ordinances. The city had its own parking regulations, separate from the HOA. Among those regulations, vehicles parked on private property, including driveways, were generally not subject to city towing unless they violated specific conditions such as blocking a fire lane, being abandoned, or having no plates at all. A vehicle with an expired registration sticker but valid plates was not, under city ordinance, subject to removal from private property without the owner's consent. The HOA's towing authorization derived entirely from the HOA's own contractual right to enforce its rules on community property. But here was the critical question: was my driveway community property? Janet pulled the property survey from county records. My driveway was within my property lines, entirely, not in a common area, not in an easement, not in any space that was HOA governed under the community property definitions. It was my private property. Janet looked at me over her coffee cup. She said, "Priya, I think they towed your car from your own private property without legal authority to do so." I said, "You mean it was illegal?" She said, "I mean it was at minimum legally questionable and possibly tortious. Towing a vehicle from private property without legal authority can constitute conversion, which is essentially unauthorized taking of personal property." I said, "What does that mean in practice?" She said, "It means you may have a civil claim against both Ridgeline Towing and the HOA for the towing fee, storage fee, and potentially additional damages." I said, "How much would that cost to pursue?" She said, "Depends, but small claims court handles up to $10,000 in this state and doesn't require an attorney." I wrote that down. Then I said, "Now tell me about their cars." Janet smiled. She said, "Okay, let's go for a walk." We walked the neighborhood that Saturday afternoon, not conspicuously, just 2 people taking a walk, the way people do. Janet had her phone out and was occasionally appearing to text, but was actually photographing things. Don Whitaker's property first. Don has 2 cars, a late-model SUV and an older pickup truck. The SUV was in the garage. The pickup was in the driveway. Janet photographed the rear plate. We walked past without stopping. Janet said quietly, "I'll check the registration status tonight." Carol Finch, 1 car, a midsize sedan parked in her driveway, photographed. Phil Barrett, 2 cars, both in the driveway. One of them, the older one, a hatchback that looked like it hadn't moved in a while, had a visible parking permit sticker on the windshield. Janet photographed it and said, "That permit sticker, I want to check what zone that's for." Steve Garvey, his work truck, his landscaping company vehicle, was parked in front of his house on the street, not in his driveway. Janet photographed it. She said, "Commercial vehicle. Let me check if there are any HOA restrictions on commercial vehicles parked in residential streets overnight." She already knew there were. I could tell by her tone. Linda Torres, both cars in the garage, nothing visible to photograph. I made a mental note that Linda was almost certainly not going to be part of whatever came next, because Linda was the one board member who had not been the problem. We completed the walk and went back to my house, and Janet opened her laptop. By 7 p.m. that evening, she had found the following. Don Whitaker's pickup truck had a registration that had expired not 11 days ago like mine, 4 months ago. 4 months. Carol Finch's sedan was currently registered, but Janet found something else. Carol had a storage unit container, one of those portable PODS units, sitting in her side yard. It had been there, based on neighbor accounts Janet had quietly gathered, for over 8 months. Section 8, subsection B of the Crestwood Park CC and RS stated that temporary storage containers were not permitted on residential properties for more than 30 days. Phil Barrett's permit sticker was for a disabled parking zone that Janet checked the DMV records, which are public, was registered to a vehicle Phil no longer owned. He had transferred the permit to his current car without proper authorization. This was not an HOA violation. This was a state DMV violation. Steve Garvey's commercial vehicle, a truck with his company logo on the side, was parked on the residential street overnight, violating Section 7, Clause A of the CC and RS, which prohibited commercial vehicles from being parked on community streets between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Janet looked at me. She said, "So, how do you want to do this?" I said, "I want to do it correctly. I want every step to be legal, documented, and by the book." She said, "Agreed. That means formal complaints to the HOA for the CC and R violations. And for Don's truck, the expired registration, that's a state matter. You can report it to the DMV or to local traffic enforcement, who can issue a citation." I said, "Can I report an expired registration on a private driveway?" She said, "You can report it to the relevant authorities. What they choose to do with it is their decision." I said, "And if they tow it?" Janet said, "Then the universe will have achieved a certain beautiful symmetry." I said, "Let's be very methodical about this." She said, "Obviously." We drafted 4 separate formal HOA complaint letters that evening, one for each violation, one for each board member, each one citing the specific CC and R provision violated and requesting remediation within the same 30-day window the HOA used for its own notices. We drafted them on my laptop, printed them, and I signed each one. Janet also drafted a separate letter, a formal demand letter, to the HOA board and to Ridgeline Towing, citing the legal analysis of the towing authorization, the property survey showing my driveway as private property, and demanding return of the $285 towing fee within 14 days, or we would file in small claims court. And I filed a report with the city's Parking Enforcement Division regarding the expired registration on Don Whittaker's pickup truck parked in his driveway. I made no editorial comment in the report. I simply reported the facts: vehicle location, plate number, observed expired registration. I sent everything certified mail on Monday morning. Then I waited. The wait lasted exactly 9 days. On the 9th day, I came home from a day shift. It was a Thursday, late afternoon, still light outside, and I turned onto Holloway Ridge and I saw it. A flatbed tow truck parked in front of Don Whittaker's house. And Don Whittaker standing in his own driveway in a bathrobe at 4:30 in the afternoon, watching a man in an orange vest hook up his pickup truck. I slowed down. I pulled into my driveway. I got out of my car. Don Whittaker looked across the street and saw me. I want to be very precise about what happened in that moment because I have thought about it many times since. I did not smile, I did not wave, I did not say anything. I simply stood beside my car in my scrubs and looked at him with an expression that I tried to make as neutral as possible. He knew I could see that he knew. The way his face changed, not dramatically, not a movie villain realization, just a slow settling of comprehension, like a man watching the weather change and understanding that he should have checked the forecast. The truck was loaded. The flatbed drove away. I went inside and made dinner. That was just the beginning. What happened over the next 3 weeks? The emergency board meeting, Carol Finch's storage pod, Phil Barrett, and the DMV. The thing Don Whittaker said to me across the street that I will never in my life forget. And the moment when the whole neighborhood found out what had been happening. All of that is in part 2. Because this story is not just about 4 tow trucks. It's about what happens when a community discovers that the people making the rules have decided the rules don't apply to them. And what happens when one person, one tired nurse in her scrubs who just wanted to park in her own driveway, decides she has had enough? Quick version, I'm Priya Anand, a nurse, and my HOA towed my car from my own private driveway because my registration sticker, which I had already renewed, hadn't arrived in the mail yet. $285. 11 p.m. No apology. So my neighbor Janet and I did our homework. We walked the neighborhood. We found that the HOA board president Don Whitaker had an expired registration on his truck, 4 months expired, not 11 days. We found CC&R violations on 3 other board members' properties. We filed formal complaints and a demand letter, and we reported Don's truck to city parking enforcement. 9 days later, Don Whitaker stood in his bathrobe and watched his truck get towed. The complaint letters I had sent to the HOA board created an interesting procedural problem for Don Whitaker. The complaints were addressed to the board, meaning, technically, they were addressed to Don himself, as president, along with the other members. Don was simultaneously the person who had to respond to the complaints and the subject of one of them. This is what Janet had anticipated when we drafted them that way. Under the CC&RS, violation notices required a response within 30 days and remediation within 60. The board was obligated to acknowledge complaints and begin the enforcement process. If they ignored my complaints, they were failing to enforce their own rules, which would undermine every future enforcement action they tried to take. If they enforced the complaints against themselves, they would be fining their own members and potentially triggering the same towing process they had used against me. Don chose a third option, which was to call an emergency board meeting. I know this because Linda Torres called me. Linda, remember, is the board member who has been outvoted consistently for 2 years and who had nothing to do with the towing of my car. She called me the day after Don's truck was towed and said, "Priya, Don has called an emergency meeting for Friday. I thought you should know." I said, "Thank you, Linda. Are you allowed to tell me what it's about?" She said, "Officially, it's about reviewing the towing contract. Unofficially, I think you know what it's about." I said, "Linda, can I ask you something directly?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Did you know about the towing contract when it was approved? Were you at that meeting?" She said, "I was not. I found out about the contract 2 weeks after it was signed. I raised concerns at the following meeting about the approval process and was told by Don that the contract was valid and the matter was closed." I said, "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" A pause. She said, "Yes, I would." Linda Torres sent me a written statement by email the following morning. It documented her account of how the towing contract had been approved without proper board authority and her attempt to raise the issue afterward. It was 2 pages, clearly written and signed. I forwarded it to Janet. Janet said, "This is extremely useful." Don's emergency meeting was on Friday evening. I was not invited. It was a board meeting, not a community meeting. But Linda was there, and she called me afterward. She said the meeting was tense. Don had wanted to discuss suspending the complaint review process while the board addressed what he called procedural irregularities in how the complaints had been filed. Carol Finch had agreed with him. Phil Barrett had agreed with him. Steve Garvey had said almost nothing. Linda had said, "Don, we can't suspend a resident's complaints because we find them inconvenient. If the complaints have merit, we have to address them." Don had said, "They don't have merit, they're retaliatory." Linda had said, "Retaliatory or not, if the violations they describe are real, we're obligated to address them. That's what our CC&RS say." The meeting had ended without resolution. Don had tabled the matter for the regular monthly meeting 2 weeks away. In those 2 weeks, several things happened. Carol's pod. Carol Finch's storage pod had been in her side yard for 8 months. The HOA's own rule said 30 days maximum. When my complaint letter arrived citing Section 8, subsection B, Carol apparently called the storage company the same day and scheduled a pickup. The pod was removed on a Wednesday morning. I saw the truck come and take it. I had not asked for the pod to be removed. I had filed a complaint through proper channels. Carol had chosen to remediate before any enforcement action was taken, which is, technically, the correct response to a violation notice. I noted the date of removal in my records. Phil and the DMV. The disabled parking permit situation with Phil Barrett was not an HOA matter, it was a state matter. I had not filed anything with the DMV or the police about it. I had simply noted it. But Janet had mentioned it to someone she knows at the county clerk's office, not as a formal report, just in the course of a conversation. That person had mentioned it to someone else. The way information moves in small bureaucratic circles, it eventually arrived at the desk of someone who cared about such things. Phil Barrett received a notice from the DMV about his parking permit approximately 3 weeks after our walk around the neighborhood. I don't know the exact mechanism. I don't need to know. I simply know that the notice arrived and that Phil Barrett drove to the DMV the following Saturday to address it, and that when he came back his car did not have the permit placard on the mirror anymore. Steve's truck. Steve Garvey's commercial truck had been parking on the street overnight in violation of Section 7. My complaint letter had noted this. Steve, to his credit, moved the truck the day after receiving the letter. He started parking it at his business property overnight and driving a personal vehicle to and from work. No drama, no pushback, he just fixed it. I respected that. Actually, Steve had a violation, he was told about it, he corrected it. That is how this is supposed to work. Don's truck, Part 2. Don's pickup truck was towed on a Thursday afternoon by city parking enforcement, following my report of the expired registration. Don retrieved his truck from the towing company, a different company than Ridgeline, a city-contracted company, at a fee of $310. He also received a citation for the expired registration. He renewed the registration the following day. The truck was back in his driveway by Friday evening. On Saturday morning, I was in my front yard pulling weeds when Don came across the street. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt, and his expression was the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say, but is not entirely confident in the script. He said, "Priya, can we talk?" I said, "Sure." He stood on the sidewalk in front of my yard. I stayed where I was, kneeling in the dirt with my gardening gloves on. I did not stand up. I did not make it easy for him to loom over me. He said, "I know you reported my truck." I said, "Don, your registration had been expired for 4 months. I reported an expired registration on a vehicle in the community. That's permitted under the same logic the HOA used when it had my car towed." He said, "Your car was towed under HOA authority. What you did with my truck was different." I said, "Was it? You saw an apparent violation and you reported it to the relevant authority. So did I. The relevant authority for an expired registration is the city, not the HOA. I reported it to the city." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and I want to be very precise about this because I have thought about it many times, he said, "What you did was personal. You did it to get back at me." I looked at him. I said, "Don, when your contractor towed my car at midnight because of a registration sticker that was 11 days delayed in the mail, when I had already renewed it, when the confirmation email was on my phone, was that personal?" He didn't answer. I said, "When you stood in your front window and watched that happen and gave me a nod and drove away, was that personal?" Still no answer. I said, "I filed every complaint correctly, through the proper channels, citing specific rules that were actually violated. I didn't make anything up. I didn't damage any property. I didn't do anything that you and this board haven't claimed the right to do to residents." He said, "I was enforcing community standards." I said, "So was I." A very long silence. Then Don said something I did not expect. He said, "The towing contract, it wasn't properly authorized, I know that." I looked at him. He said, "I had the authority as president to enter into service contracts under a certain dollar threshold. The attorney we consulted at the time said the threshold covered it. I've since been told that interpretation is questionable." I said, "Questionable?" He said, "I made a decision and I may have made it incorrectly, and the outcome of that decision was that your car was towed from your private property." He paused. "I'm sorry about that." I stayed very still. In my experience, apologies like this one, the kind that come after consequences, after the truck has already been towed, after the formal complaints have arrived, means something different from the kind that come before. But they still mean something. I said, "I want my $285 back." He said, "The HOA will reimburse you. I'll bring it to the board." I said, "I also want the towing contract with Ridgeline reviewed and the community notified about what happened. Not by me, by the board, officially." He said, "That's going to be difficult." I said, "Don, I have a demand letter ready to file in small claims court. I have Janet's legal analysis showing the contract may not have been properly authorized. I have Linda Torr's written statement about how the contract was approved. I have a case. What I don't have is a desire to spend my limited free time in a courtroom. What I'd rather have is the 285, a community notice, and a policy review. That's it. That's all I'm asking." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Okay." He walked back across the street. I went back to pulling weeds. The regular monthly HOA meeting happened 2 weeks after Don, and I talked in my front yard. I went. I brought Janet. I brought my folder of documentation. The community room was full. Word had gotten around, not the full story, but pieces of it. Don's truck being towed, my complaints, the drama. 30-something residents showed up, which was about triple the normal attendance. Don ran the meeting. He was controlled and professional, which I will give him credit for. He opened with what he called a transparency update. He told the community that the board had reviewed the towing contract with Ridgeline and determined that it had been approved in a process that did not fully comply with the CC and RS requirements for vendor contracts. He said the contract was being terminated. He said the board was reimbursing a resident. He did not name me, but everyone knew, for a towing fee that had been assessed in error. Carol Finch looked at the table the whole time he spoke. Phil Barrett nodded along. Steve Garvey looked like he was relieved to be alive. Linda Torres looked like a woman who had been waiting for this for 2 years. Don then said, "The board has also received several resident complaints regarding CC and R violations, including some relating to board members' own properties. The board is committed to equal enforcement of community rules, and we are addressing those complaints through the same process we apply to all residents." Someone in the audience, I don't know who, said, "Does that include the president's own violations?" Don said, "Yes, it includes everyone." A murmur went through the room. Then a woman named Rosario Vega, who lives 3 doors down from me and who I knew had her own HOA complaint history, raised her hand and said, "I want to ask about the general enforcement policy. Are there written guidelines for how the board decides what to cite and what not to cite? How do we know violations are being applied consistently?" Don said, "The board uses its discretion." Rosario said, "That's the problem." The room was quiet. Then several people started talking at once, not chaotically, but with the particular energy of a room that has been given permission to say things it has been holding. The meeting ran an hour over schedule. By the end, the board had agreed to 3 things: to post all violation notices and responses in a community log accessible to all residents, to establish a written enforcement priority policy, and to bring the proposed policy to a community vote before implementation. Linda Torres made the motion for all 3. Steve Garvey seconded. Don, Carol, and Phil voted yes. I think because by that point they understood that voting no in front of 30 residents who were paying very close attention would be a different kind of problem. The motion passed 5-0. Where we are now. It has been 14 months since my car was towed from my own driveway at midnight. The towing contract with Ridgeline was terminated. The HOA has not contracted with any towing company since. Parking issues in the community are now handled through written notices and a graduated fine process, exactly the way every other violation is handled. I received my $285 back in the form of a check mailed to my house with a cover letter from the board acknowledging that the towing had been in error. I framed the cover letter. It is on my refrigerator. Debatable whether that is petty, but I have decided it is not. The community violation log is now posted on the HOA's website. Every notice sent, every response received, every resolution. Residents can see the full picture of how enforcement is being applied across the community. Since the log went live, 3 residents have filed complaints about violations that had been ignored for years. All 3 were addressed within the standard timeline. Don Whittaker did not run for re-election at the November board elections. He told a neighbor of mine that he was stepping back to let new voices lead, which I thought was a graceful way to put it. I do not hate Don Whittaker. I think he is a man who had real authority and used it without thinking carefully about whether he was using it fairly. I think the experience of having his own truck towed and of sitting in a room full of his neighbors and acknowledging that he had done something wrong was genuinely difficult for him. I hope it was instructive. Carol Finch also did not run. Phil Barrett ran and lost by 11 votes to a man named Kevin Park, who had never served on an HOA board in his life and whose entire campaign consisted of a single promise: I will apply the rules the same way to everybody. Kevin won by 11 votes. Linda Torres ran for president. She won. Linda's first act as president was to send a community-wide email with 3 attachments: the full CC and RS, the new enforcement policy, and a 1-page summary of resident rights under the HOA's governing documents. She wrote in the email, "Every resident deserves to understand the rules that govern this community and to know that those rules will be applied consistently and fairly. That starts today." I printed that email. It is also on my refrigerator next to the apology letter. My car is in my driveway. It is currently registered. The sticker is on the plate, fresh and bright, renewed the day it was due. I am not giving anyone anything to work with. But I also know now that I have the tools, the knowledge, the process, the documentation habits. I know what fair governance looks like, and I know what it looks like when it breaks down, and I know what one person, one tired person in scrubs at midnight, can do when she decides that being pushed around is not the only option available to her. I work nights. I come home exhausted. I want to park my car in my driveway and go to sleep in peace. That is not too much to ask. And I am not going to stop asking for it.